Welcome back to Skills Upgrade, a Talking Drupal miniseries following the journey of a Drupal 7 developer learning Drupal 10. This is episode 6. I'm Amy June Heinlein. I'm a Drupal mentor coordinator and work at the Linux Foundation as their certification community architect. Now, during this mini-series, we'll follow a Drupal 7 developer as he upgrades his skills to work on Drupal 10 projects with that ultimate goal of supporting Drupal 10 project and contributing back to the community. This is a weekly show. Each week, a mentor will review the developer's progress, answer questions, and set goals for the upcoming week. Now, our developer is Chad Hester. You can find him at Chad Hester on Drupal.org. He is an enterprise technical consultant and solutions architect with a background in website development for over 20 years. And our mentor, again, is Mike Anello, Ultimike on Drupal.org. Mike is the co-founder and vice president of Drupal Easy, a Drupal training and consulting firm based in Central Florida. Now, in episode 5, if you remember, Mike tasked Chad with going through the JS example module and looking at some of those template files. Let's find out how he did.
Hey, Chad, welcome back. I think we're on week 6, right?
Yeah. Making it all the way towards the end.
I know. That's amazing. So I was thinking just a little while ago, like, and I don't even know if we've covered this on even in episode 1. But like, what's your plan? Like, what are you going to do with all this new knowledge? I'm not even sure. You may have told me this before, and I apologize if I forgot. But I think you're currently working in Drupal, right? Or you're just getting back into it
Yeah, I've been working with Drupal nonstop since 2008. I just haven't really done any development work since about 2016. So I mean, site building, content management, solutions architecture. I mean, all of that I've been doing for quite a while, and that's still
it's all coming back to me now. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, no worries. But I think like you start to get that far into your career, and you kind of shift to different areas like management, leadership, design, like sales even. And those are things that I still do. But I am open for work. Part of the impetus of doing kind of the refresh for development is to say, well, even if I am doing those roles ongoing, benefit directly from having some refreshed development experience. Plus, added bonus, I can do development work. So anybody that's looking for someone who's either a solutions architect, sales engineer, and soon to be Drupal developer, that's stuff that I'm looking for. So get in touch with me on LinkedIn or take a look at my website for my services and rates.
I think that's a pretty potent combination. Right. So like the ability to, I don't want to say do Drupal sales, but like that's kind of what a solutions architect does, right? Yeah. They're the technical salesperson, but being able to, so having that skill, but also being able to back it up with actual module development experience that you can point to. Yeah. And say, oh, I helped maintain this module over there, this thing over there. That's a pretty nice combination, I think.
Thank you. I think it's something that a lot of people find themselves in during their career if they're in something long enough. So yeah, it's something that I'd love to keep doing.
All right. Well, let's talk about last week's material. And that was, you were going to take a look at the JS example submodule of our favorite examples module. So how'd you find that?
It was about as straightforward as I would have expected it to be from a general perspective. You know, the idea of attaching JavaScript, you don't want to load every single JavaScript library that's possible within every page load, because good Lord, that's a lot of resources for a browser to have to deal with.
Yeah, especially if you don't need it.
Yeah. So I really like how it partitions things out. There are a lot more files than I'm used to. Which is good that I'm kind of refreshing a little bit and understanding the new Drupalism ways of doing things. I guess the breakdown of files, just going through each one, just the typical info module, then the libraries, the routes, the menu, that made a lot of sense from our previous understanding. But then getting into the libraries and understanding how that relates to those routes and what it is that it's attempting to do.
Libraries are really interesting because I think that 90% of Drupal developers out there use 10% of the functionality that libraries provide. And that's often enough. Like that's enough for the vast majority of sites, but there's so much you can do with libraries as far as you can override existing libraries. You can tell an existing library to go away, that you don't want to actually use it. Because that library is defined in YAML, and that YAML gets cached, whenever there's a cache rebuild. So then at that point, it's almost like you can alter it at that point. You can alter that array of libraries and then you can do some really wacky stuff if you need to. But fortunately, I think most folks don't normally need to do that. Normally, we just basically need to add a new library or two to our custom theme and off we go. So I think libraries are really interesting. And it's really, for me, it's maybe 1 out of 5, 6, 7, 8 sites where I actually have to do something more than just adding a new library.
I think this also introduces something new that we haven't really dug too deep into, which is the idea that, you've got your back-end developers who might do integrations and migrations. You've got your front-end developers who might work on more theming or the rare decoupled type of a website. But when you're loading JavaScript, that's traditionally thought of more as a front-end activity. So the temptation might be to introduce that in the theming layer, which isn't necessarily wrong. But if you're doing a more component-based design sort of approach, or this load it when you need it sort of approach, it sounds like it's more appropriate to think of that from the module level for certain circumstances.
Yeah, I think so. We got to be careful here that we don't, work our way into a conversation about like either web components or even like Drupal's fantastic single directory components, experimental module, which is, those areas are definitely not my forte.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. There are definitely use cases where adding libraries and modules is the appropriate thing to do, as opposed to adding libraries and themes when it's more just for styling purposes. Yeah. Right? So any questions from last week?
Yeah, a few. Obviously, as we dig into code, there's new concepts. There's also some refresh of old concepts. Like I'm already familiar with previously how Drupal would introduce things like templates that themes could then subsequently override, and also some of the hooks related to that. So really the first question, I'm familiar with render arrays from my previous Drupal 7 and earlier days. Those are some pretty older Drupal concepts. But sure. In a world full of documentation for Drupal, a lot of times I'll go to Drupal.org first. But it looked like if I were to try to figure out, okay, the return for a hook theme, as just an example, is a render array. So where do I find out the structure for that and what values to include for each one of those data keys? And I think I have the answer was in the Drupal API render API. And there's a specific page just for render arrays, which was really helpful. But do you feel like that's the best resource, or are there others that you would recommend?
Yeah, that's the best place to start, I think.
Okay.
Because that provides you a nice top, like that initial level of array keys in the render array. Where things start getting almost immediately fuzzy is the next layer, or then the next level, the next like down, because you can. There's custom implementations. You can throw everything into that render array. Depending on what you need ultimately in your template field. So, there's not going to be any documentation that is the be all and end all of this is everything you will ever see in a render array. That's never going to happen. But I think what's on that doc page, and we'll obviously link to it in the show notes, that's kind of the price of admission. Right.
Okay.
To understanding render arrays. That's a good place to start. And then, you will obviously, if you're overriding node templates, then you're going to start seeing the same things, at the next level deep and you'll see patterns develop, but there's no one, it's probably impossible to have one. And the funny thing is about this, I talk about this a lot from a completely different perspective when I'm teaching module development. And I'm talking about PHP stan. Mm-hmm. So this is a little bit of an aside, but I'll mention it as quickly as I can. When you're running PHP stan checks, a lot of times PHP stan wants argument arrays fully documented by type.
Okay.
And, so like one of those types is if you're passing like the variables array around into a preprocessor or something, there's no way that anyone's ever going to be able to write a doc block that describes the exact type of the variables array all the way down to the bottom, because it's a variables array is what it is. Right. So yeah, it's just not possible for there to be one resource. But I think the best we can do is probably what we have, as a first pass, the doc page that you mentioned.
And this also reminds me of something. Again, this is the rustiness, but little thoughts like this just cross my mind when I'm kind of digging into it, is the idea of doing a variable dump of some sort, using a tool to see, well, what does this currently have in it, so I can familiarize myself.
Again, yeah, you can use the devel module and Kint and stuff for that, like that. But I'd go right to Xdebug for that.
Okay.
It's just faster, and then you can actually use like the debug console to really drill down and really focus on what you want to see. The other thing you mentioned about overriding template files. I think overriding template files in modern Drupal is so much better, easier, faster, consistent than in Drupal 7. So that was like that's one of the it's one of the huge wins in modern Drupal, is like the whole templating system.
So basically the idea of this JavaScript example module was that it's introducing an accordion, and if I didn't like that it's using an H2 tag, which is notoriously an accessibility problem when you have bad nesting or something like that, is I could override that at my own theme level and make it a bit more variable. Okay, so that still works, it sounds like, and is the correct approach, right?
It works, and it's easier to do in modern Drupal than it is in Drupal 7.
All right. Some other questions, and I suspect that we might get into this a little bit more when we talk about testing, because this week wasn't so much a homework assignment about testing, but every single time I open one of these example modules, I see tests, and it just gets my brain going about how does Drupal.org itself, like if I write a test specifically to help the community and contrib, how does Drupal.org actually run the test and then provide the results of that test?
Magic. Next question. No. So this is it's a great question, and the answer has changed in the past year, much to the benefit. Before, and actually still currently, I think the cutoff is July 1st of this year. Drupal.org had a bespoke system, called Drupal CI, that would automatically see the patch and run it on this bespoke system. I'm pretty sure it would spin up like a bunch of Amazon, instances somewhere and run them, and it would take some time, and the results would just be output, back into the issues interface on Drupal.org. A couple of years ago, probably more than a couple now, I'm terrible thinking back how long things were, but we've started integrating Drupal code into GitLab. So I'm going to say sometime last year, GitLab CI support was added, and it's been slowly maturing and being tested. And it was rolled out. First, it was opt-in, and then it was kind of rolled out for all projects. And that's pretty much the way to do it now. Drupal CI is going to be turned off. I believe the date is July 1st of this year. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong there. But for module maintainers, it's actually, using GitLab CI is fantastic because it's so much more flexible than the old Drupal CI, and it's built on an open source tool. It's no longer Drupalism. So you can imagine all of the bespoke code that went along with Drupal CI it's all going to go away. And it's, we're just using all of GitLab CI's tools. Module maintainers, it's pretty straightforward. They can just add a GitLab CI.yaml file, and the Drupal Association provides templates for that, which are super easy to use. And so if there's tests in the right place in the module, and the GitLab CI file is there and configured properly, then anytime there is a merge request, GitLab CI will just pick it up and merge it in, or in a test environment, run that merge request, see if all the tests pass. Module maintainers can also opt into PHP-CS checks and PHP stand checks and some other checks that they can do, and they can run it against different major versions of Drupal and different versions of PHP. And I mean, it's really very cool how GitLab CI works. And
so, sounds like a really good rabbit hole, but for someone kind of learning the new way of doing things for Drupal 8 and above, you might as well learn the GitLab CI method instead of
absolutely.
Yeah.
100%. It's just like if you're new, and you're not new to this part, but I don't even, when I teach this stuff or mentor this stuff, I don't mention patches anymore. It's all, GitLab issue forks and merge requests these days. So next week when we start talking about a test for you to write and the module and stuff like that, we'll probably talk about this a bit more.
Well, that's the exciting part for me, because I remember the many days of patches and comments, and even before that, the CSV or CVS days.
Oh golly, and GitLab CI is so much faster than the. So I mean, it's win after win after win after win, and huge shout outs go out to the engineers at the DA and the other contributors, because it's great work.
Economy of scale, when you got tens of thousands of Drupal projects that could potentially run tests, that those resources are precious.
Yep. Big deal. Yep.
So there was, I think, a couple other questions that are a little bit different than those two. But again, as we're going through these examples, we've talked a little bit about routing, and we got into a little bit of the plugin API. Mm-hmm. But then that prompts like, okay, well, those are some really good foundational things. Mm-hmm. Are there other Drupal APIs and hooks that I should review next to handle more popular development cases? Like, I'm assuming Form API is one that I recall.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. It's a tough question to answer because it really depends on what kind of work you do. But I think, the event system, being able to write a custom event class and then using Symfony's event listener, event subscriber system it's not even that hard, but it's super valuable to have in your back pocket. For some reason, I've always liked the Q API. I like for long running tasks. So I like the Q API. Plugins, that's probably my number one. If you understand how to make one plugin, you understand how to make most plugins, I think. Okay. I know folks who their go-to is a custom entity type. I am the opposite. I try to avoid writing custom entity types because that introduces a bucket load of custom code that, with modules like Entity Construction Kit, even paragraphs module that are fieldable entities, I often look for reasons to not have to write a custom entity. But I know folks who that's their go-to, and that's fine. I think that's a pretty good list, though. I don't think I want to add to it because you asked me for some.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think at some point it's like, okay, here's the page with all the APIs. Good luck. But no, I think that's a good call out. And the second part, I guess, to that question is, with Drupal 7 hitting end of life, I think one of the biggest APIs that people are going to pay attention to is the Migrate API. So what do you think a good resource would be to prepare for migrations, aside from just looking at the Migrate API documentation by itself? Are there other good resources for Drupal migrations?
Yeah. So this is going to sound like a plug, but it's not me. I'm plugging somebody else. UnderstandDrupal.com. Okay. It's a site from Mauricio Dinarte. And full disclosure, Mauricio does help me with our courses and teaching and stuff. I have nothing to do with Understand Drupal. For me, he is like one of the go-to Drupal migration folks out there. There's other folks out there. I don't think they have any bandwidth, to be honest. Some of the folks who are still kind of the flag bearers for some of the migrate related modules, and as well as the core maintainers for some of the migrate modules. But Mauricio teaches migration. He's got an ebook, 31 Days of Migrations, I think it's called. And he's got a video course as well. Like he is, his stuff is fantastic for migrations. And yeah, that's what I would recommend there.
Okay. Yeah, that's really high up on my list to pay attention to this year, just because of the timing of everything. And I remember Mauricio and several of his DrupalCon talks and things like that. So that's good.
Yep. Yeah, he's a great community member, and he's a fountain of knowledge when it comes to migration stuff.
Couldn't agree more.
All right, you ready for next week?
Yeah, let's talk about next week.
All right, so we've got 3 weeks left. So the big picture is this next week, you're going to be looking at, this is going to be our last little foray into the examples module. Should be no surprise, but there is a testing example module in there, submodule. So I want you to go through that. But actually before, well, you already have it. I know you already have your local site set up for that. But, and I believe we've talked about this in week 1, but you just want to confirm that you've got the core dev dependencies installed. So that's a composer require Drupal/core dev. In order to run PHP unit tests locally, and this is something that, in my opinion, there's more friction than there should be. You need a PHP unit. Well, I shouldn't say you need. It's extremely helpful if you have a PHP unit.xml file, which is just the configuration file for running PHP unit tests. It's just like any other desktop app, phone app. There's a settings area, right? Well, command line apps have settings as well. For PHP unit, it's this PHP unit.xml file. And because Drupal is like this behemoth with tentacles and everything, it's, there's quite a few things that need to go into that PHP unit.xml file. Now, Drupal core comes with one, but it's really just geared for running Drupal core tests.
Okay.
So in order to kind of set up a more generic PHP unit.xml file, there are definitely some resources on Drupal.org to help you with it. And this is kind of analogous to the settings.local.php thing we talked about weeks ago. There is no, in my opinion, and I'll make sure we're moving into Mike's opinion territory here. In my opinion, there's no one go-to place that says, this is how to set up a PHP unit.xml file for the Drupal recommended project composer template. So I'm going to give you, and it's a public GitLab snippet. The link can go in the show notes and all that stuff. It's a PHP unit.xml file that you can put in the project root of a Drupal recommended project composer template. There's a couple little things that you'll have to tweak that are dependent on like the site name, not the site name, but the site URL and stuff like that. But it has everything else you need. And there's a bunch of paths in there that if they're not right, relative to where that file lives, it's not going to work. So this everything there is set up.
Getting more stuff.
Yeah. So it's all set up to live in the project root of a Drupal recommended project composer template site. So take a look at that file, put it in the right place. And then before you dive into any code at all, make sure you can run tests. This is normally like when I mentor folks on core contribution or at contribution days at Drupal events and stuff, if they want to do testing stuff, it's normally about a half hour of let's make sure everything's in the right place before we even think about writing a test. Right? Because if you can't run like a core unit test, then you're not running anything. So so just run. I think I actually gave you in the handout, and anything in the handout can go in the show notes as far as I'm concerned. Just a command line call to run all of the tests that are in that examples module, testing example. Just make sure the tests run before you even look at code. Once you get that far, then there's a few tests in that module. You can look through them all. I can tell you that I'm going to assign you next week to write a functional test. Because I think functional tests are the easiest type of test to kind of visualize as someone new to writing tests. So there's more than 3 functional tests in the examples module, in the testing example module of the examples project. And I kind of list them, 3 that you should look at in order. Start with one called front page link test, and then front page link dependencies test, and then testing example menu test. And none of these tests are very difficult. Yeah. But what's important is that you kind of see, you have to define the theme. It's a functional test. So it's kind of like, it's an imaginary browser, right? You have to close your eyes and say, okay, what do I want this test to do? I want to go to this URL as this type of user. Then I want to enter this value into this field and hit the button on that page. Then on the page that comes back up, I want to make sure that the following text appears. Like that's a functional test. That's and so in order to set up a test like that, you kind of have to know some things, or you have to define some things. You have to define, okay, well, what modules have to be enabled in order for all this stuff to actually happen? Because when you're running a functional test by default, Drupal doesn't use the standard installation profile. It doesn't even use the minimal installation profile. It uses a testing profile.
So it's all stripped down. That's very few. What you tell it to do.
Stripped down. Yep. So you have to, so there's a little modules array as part of functional tests to dictate which modules are available. There's also you have to declare which theme you want. Because functional tests, they can be kind of slow, because a functional test it's not using your existing database. It's installing a brand new database just for that test. So it's got to go through the Drupal installation process, granted a stripped down one. We want to do everything we can to make these tests run as quickly as possible, because we're paying for it, GitLab CI, right? So a lot of times, all a test needs is the Stark theme. And that's one of the reasons why the Stark themes exist, because there's nothing there.
Yeah.
But if you're writing a test that depends on a specific theme, then yeah, you need to be able to set that theme. But you'll see that in a functional test as well. Then there's a setup method. It's kind of an optional thing that anything you put in the setup method will be run for all of your test methods, and then there's test methods. And as part of like test methods, you'll see that there are some super useful functions that are part of the browser test-based class. And the browser test-based class is what not all, but many functional tests extend. And it's just got a bunch of really handy convenience functions.
Okay, so that's the blind browser, if you will.
Yeah. Well, no, it's not the blind browser. It's more of just like it's a really solid foundation to build your test on top of. And I'll give you one example. So there is a method in that browser, and I should probably mention this as well, that within code and even in conversations, functional tests are browser tests. Those two terms are synonyms. You will hear some people referring to them as browser tests, some of people referring to them as functional tests, but they are the same, which is confusing if you don't know. So that's why I'm being very specific.
Well, now I know.
Now you know. So as an example of something that browser test base class provides, is it provides a Drupal create user method. And it takes an argument of an array of permissions that user should have. So if you're testing the ability for a user to go to like the path auto configuration page and do something there, then that user has to have the right permission to access that page.
Okay.
Right? Now, if we didn't have that little function, that little helper, that little Drupal create user function, what would we have to do? We would have to create a role. Then we'd have to create a user entity. Then we'd have to associate the right permission with that Drupal role. Then we'd have to assign that role to that user.
Yeah.
Right? So there's 4 or 5 steps in there. But this Drupal create user method, just you say, I want a user, has to have this permission, go do it. And browser test space will create a role, put it in the middle between the user and the permission, create the user, and hand you back a fully loaded, ready to go user object. So one line of code. So it's got a lot of stuff like that.
So you're saying that it has to do a lot of things that would otherwise, I would presume, be in config. And you're saying that this is also a brand new install. It's not making any presumptions about your own instance. So am I right in saying that any config that you would have in your install should basically be ignored? Like
any config that you have in your install, if it's config in like the config sync directory, like the site's config, your test does not know about that.
Okay, that's what I thought. Okay.
Here's what your test knows about. if you say, okay, my module is dependent on, I'm trying to think of it, say Bootstrap paragraphs module.
Mm-hmm.
Say this test is dependent on Bootstrap paragraphs. And I'm pretty sure I'm right on this. Let's assume, and I think I'm right. Bootstrap paragraphs has a config/install directory with a bunch of config, so that anytime a site enables Bootstrap paragraphs, you get all this config, which is a bunch of paragraph types. In that case, your test install will have all of that information architecture from Bootstrap paragraphs config install, because that's kind of the law, right? If you enable a module and that module has config/install stuff, you get that.
Okay.
So any other config that you want, you have to create, or it has to be part of a module that you enable. And this is another thing that when you're new to writing tests, and for me, it took me an embarrassingly long time before it really sunk in, where I'd be writing tests and I would be assuming that the stuff I have on my local site is available in the test.
Yeah, content types, other things like that. Yeah.
And even after I learned that it wasn't, I still couldn't get it out of my head that it was. Like it was, but you just kind of have to somehow you got to get your brain there and say, okay, I have a zero site here.
Yeah.
And it can make writing functional tests like a lot of setup. That's one of the reasons why that setup method exists. But functional tests are, in my opinion, if a lot of clients don't have, let me put it this way, a lot of clients that I have don't have huge budgets to write tests, right? So when I write custom modules for clients, I make sure I include some time to write tests, and I try and max it out as much as I can, but that's normally one of the first things to get cut. But if I can only spend 4 hours writing tests for a custom module, I will almost always write a functional test. Not always, but I will almost always write a functional test, because that's kind of like the MVP test, right? That's kind of the minimum viable product. If I update this module 2 years from now, does the main thing this module is supposed to be doing, is it still doing it?
Yeah.
So it's not exclusively all functional tests. It depends what the module does. If it's up to me, I love unit tests. I think unit tests, if you have enough time and just to figure out, okay, how do what kind of unit, or even kernel tests, which are not really the same thing, but definitely related, more closer to unit tests than functional tests. I think the more time you have, at least for me, the more I'd probably write more unit and kernel tests. The less time I have would be a functional test. But for a client, if you're trying to explain to a client what this test does, it's a lot easier, I think, to justify writing a functional test.
It saves a lot of time long term.
Yeah, I think so. So for next week, the testing example module, I think it has a couple unit tests in there as well. And the functional tests by no means are super in-depth, but they will get you, I think, 80 to 90% of the building blocks of what I think you're going to need for the next week.
Okay. Yeah, I can see how that applies. Just getting my hands dirty with these things, and then seeing how we do in more of a real world sort of scenario.
Yep, absolutely. And I think we'll keep it on the down low for this week, but I do have a module and a maintainer all lined up. And I even have an idea for a test you can write. So my prep for next week is going to be super easy because it's already done.
Making the world better one test at a time, right?
There you go. All right. I think that's about it. We got anything else?
I think that's great. I think this will keep me busy, and I'm looking forward to how it actually unfolds.
All right. Have at it.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Mike.
After digging into those templates, Chad had some great questions about render arrays, accessibility, and overriding node templates. And starting with that render array API was the best place, and Mike explained how patterns will develop as we start overriding our template files. And it's more straightforward in Drupal 7 versus Drupal 8. He also explains it's a variable array and that there's no one resource to look at. So you kind of got to dig deep when you're trying to learn this stuff. But I absolutely love that Chad is asking about the migration API and what resources we have when moving our Drupal 7 sites to Drupal 10. Because honestly, some of us haven't moved to more relevant versions of Drupal because we still have those lingering Drupal 7 sites. Mike also explains that we need to make sure that everything is in the right place before we set up tests and to get those tests running before we even look at the code. I also learned that Drupal CI is going away and we'll be moving to GitLab, which will make all of our testing more straightforward if we have those tests written. And module maintainers will be able to opt into all of those different kinds of rad tests. Next week, Chad will get his hands dirty writing some of those functional tests, one step closer to that ultimate goal of contributing tests back to the Drupal project. And giving code to open source is a wonderful feeling. Again, Skills Upgrade is supported by Talking Drupal and Drupal Easy. You can visit talkingdrupal.com for this episode's show notes and resources, and you can visit drupaleasy.com and register for an upcoming intensive Drupal training course. To learn more or contact Chad, you can find him at chadkhester.com. And Mike Anello, you can contact him through drupaleasy.com/contact-us. And he's Ultimike across all of the things, Mastodon, LinkedIn, X, I think it's called now. And I'm Volkswagen Chick on Mastodon and LinkedIn. And I want to remind folks, because I work at the Linux Foundation, we're offering a discount of 30% off e-learning courses, certifications, and bundles with the code all uppercase Drupal24. And that's good through June 5th. And you can find those in the notes as well. Thank you. And I'm really looking forward to what we have to see next week.